Welcome to story time. So I'm going to do something really crazy. I'm going to try and summarize like 250 some odd years of Roman history in like 15 minutes. Okay, I know it's impossible, but let's do it. So this is what we've covered so far in terms of the Roman Republic, starting in 509, and we got all the way down to 387 when Brennus, the Gallic chieftain, actually burned down the city of Rome except for the Capitoline Hill, supposedly. Okay, so what happens after that? Well, the Romans decide to rebuild. Well, yeah, you probably figured that out. Think about it though. Lots of towns and cities across the millennia have been destroyed by war or natural disaster or whatnot, and most of them end up getting rebuilt. You know, people are stubborn. What can I say? So the first major thing I want to tell you is that shortly after Rome was in the process of being rebuilt, they passed this really important law, the Lex Licinia Sextia, in the year 367 BCE. And look what it did. It addressed the issue of debt, which we talked about in previous videos as being a major source of strain between patricians and plebeians, mostly for the plebeians, of course, and that debt should be paid off in 3 annual installments and not all at once. That seems reasonable. That nobody should possess more than 500 acres of land, because to do otherwise would seem excessive. And finally, oh, here's the big boy of them all. One of each year's co-consuls must be a plebeian. And yeah, so the Romans fought long and hard for it. I don't want to get into the details, but it was like a 10-year-long battle, legislative battle, just to get them to enact this. Now, out of these 3, 2 of them were enacted, and one of them, though, was not ever really followed, and that's number 2. More to come on that later on. Okay, so then, it's not an exaggeration to say that after the Lex Licinia Sextia, things kind of calmed down between the patricians and plebeians, because now you have plebeians who are in positions of power. And so Rome started fighting externally and not necessarily internally so much anymore. And boy, did they ever fight. Oh my gosh, they fought so many wars. You're going to notice from this year, 343, pretty much all the way down until the year that Julius Caesar is born, Rome just is like fighting nonstop. Now you notice they fight 3 wars with a group of people called the Samnites. They also fight the Latin War, and then they fight against this guy Pyrrhus of Epirus. Now let me just tell you about the Samnites and the Latin War really quickly. So here's Rome. I can't tell what color this is, like kind of reddish, something like that. The Romans started fighting against the towns of the Latin League once again, and they beat them. And so then they got all this territory right here. But then, of course, they were sort of against the Samnites, because their new territory butted up against the Samnites. Samnites were sort of a fierce mountain folk who lived in central Italy. And they fought initially over this town down here called Capua, which was really important for the Romans because of the fertile soil. It was sort of near Naples and near, of course, Mount Vesuvius. It was sort of like the breadbasket of mainland Italy. So, of course, the Romans wanted to keep it, naturally. And so the Romans fought 3 really, really long wars with the Samnites. How did they win those wars? Well, it wasn't always so pretty. I mean, my goodness, here's the Roman army at one point getting defeated. They had to strip naked and walk underneath a yoke while the Samnite army yells at them and insults them and holds up, decapitated heads on sticks. Oh boy. But how do they eventually win? Well, the Romans built a road. Boom, there it is. Very famous road called the Via Appia, named after Appius Claudius, the censor who built the road. And the road sort of like cut through the heart of Samnite territory, and it was able to make sure that the Roman army could get from point A to point B very, very, very quickly. And then what else did they do during the 3rd and final Samnite War? They were told by the oracle that they had to bring the worship of the god Asclepius, the god of healing and medicine, to Rome, which they did. And on Tiber Island, there it is, overhead shot, they built, boom, the Temple of Asclepius / hospital. And guess what? It's still a hospital today. So there you go. Boom. Now, after they defeated the Samnites, Rome got all of that territory in central Italy. But this territory down here, which is in a color that I cannot even possibly begin to see, beige maybe? I don't know. Anyway, this territory down here, this was all settled by Greek colonists a long time ago. And the Romans kind of picked a fight with this town down here called Tarentum. And what did Tarentum do? Well, they called over to, big boy Greece, this guy in particular, who was the king of Epirus, a kingdom in Greece. His name was Pyrrhus. And they were like, hey, can you come help us defeat these Romans? And so Pyrrhus comes over, boom, and as you can see is like going all throughout Italy and into Sicily, fighting the Romans every step of the way. And he's got a secret. Ooh, look at this. He fights with elephants. And the Romans are like, what? Elephants? Oh my God, turn and run. What are we going to do? Now, here's the thing about Rome's fighting with Pyrrhus. Even though Pyrrhus, got really close to Rome, he never quite got as close as he should have. He might have been able to take it, but he decided not to at the last minute. He fought a bunch of battles against the Romans, and every single time he beat the Romans, but the Romans inflicted such damage on him that it really wasn't much of a victory. And so even though he won every single battle, he lost the war as a whole. And to do that nowadays is called a Pyrrhic victory in his honor. And then Pyrrhus eventually, after 5 years of fighting the Romans, were like, I'm done with this. These people are pretty strong. I'm leaving. And so he leaves. Now, once he leaves, what happens is that the Romans then take over all of this area. So now they have central Italy, south, southern Italy, and of course what comes next is right across the strait there, you've got, boom, Sicily. And yeah, that's what they're going to fight over next. And in fact, they fight against Carthage, who's sort of like their big rival powerhouse in the Mediterranean. Carthage, as you might remember, is a city in modern-day Tunisia in North Africa. Very, very powerful Mediterranean city, had a huge navy, were renowned for their sailing abilities. Romans were terrible sailors. The Carthaginians were like the best ever, okay? And they were also renowned for their business practices. Extremely wealthy country, city-state, I should say. And now the Romans fight against the Carthaginians. The Romans called them Punici, and so, boom, they fought 3 wars against them. First Punic War, Second Punic War, Third Punic War. Look how long that first one is, 264 to 241. Good God. The second one, boom, that's the one where Rome almost gets wiped off the face of the map. And then the Third Punic War was pretty short. Totally unprovoked war, by the way, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then in between all that, though, Rome was fighting a lot in Greece, Spain, and Eastern Europe. I mean, just like constant fighting. They're not fighting each other, they're fighting outwardly. Now, of course, they're eventually, going to start fighting each other again, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, First Punic War, let's kind of cover that. Well, it's all about the island of Sicily. Carthage controlled like the western half, the Greeks controlled the eastern half, and then Rome kind of made some alliances with Syracuse and whatnot and got over here and started fighting the Carthaginians. And really long war, fought mostly not on land actually, but at sea. And the Romans, as I said, were really, really bad at anything dealing with sailing. So what they did was they decided, you know what, we're going to build this thing called a corvus, the raven or the beak, whatever you want to call it. And it's this large device. And so we're essentially going to get in our boats and we're going to sail really, really close to our enemy and then boom, throw it down. And this big metal spike is going to go kerplunk in the enemy ship. And then we're going to run across the bridge and therefore turn a sea battle into a land battle, which is exactly what they did. And they did that enough times to be able to defeat the Carthaginians in the First Punic War. And they took ship parts back to the city of Rome, and they put it, as you learned way back at the beginning of Latin 3, on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the city of Rome. Now, what did they get from the First Punic War? Well, Rome got, of course, boom, Sicily, ding, 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 and they punished Carthage by making Carthage pay an extraordinary amount of money that it was supposedly going to take Carthage, 30 or 40 years to pay off, and they paid it off in 10 years because, they were kind of awesome. All right, now moving on. Now, the losing general of the First Punic War was a guy named Hamilcar Barca. Barcelona is named after him, by the way. And he had a son named Hannibal, and he made Hannibal swear an oath. He's like, I need you to put your hand on that altar, big boy, little boy, and I need you to look over here at the she-wolf and these nursing twins, which represents Rome, and I need you to swear upon everything you hold holy that you will stop at nothing until you destroy them. And he was like, okay, Dad, sure, I will. Now, he grows up, Hannibal does, and he decides to do it. He's like, yeah, okay, he raises an army. Now, the Carthaginians controlled Spain, and so Hannibal takes a whole bunch of elephants, which were native to North Africa at the time, and sails across the Atlantic there, and goes into Spain, and then decides to take the elephants and his army across the Alps mountains in the middle of winter to do a little sneak attack on the Romans in northern Italy. Oh my God, poor elephant, look at that, falling. Oh, and there's all kinds of weird stories about this, including, Hannibal accidentally causing an avalanche, which, killed half his army, but whatever. Moving on. Boom, the Romans were totally taken by surprise, and look at this, they're fighting against elephants, they don't know what they're doing. It's kind of like, Empire Strikes Back, hello, anybody? And all kinds of weird stories, eventually the Romans had to resort to guerrilla warfare. They appointed this guy as dictator, very famous Roman named Quintus Fabius Maximus, Cunctator, the delayer, and yet Romans were still really hard-headed and were like, no, we're going to fight Hannibal face to face, even though he's beaten us so many times. And at the Battle of Cannae, the armies of both co-consuls were actually totally destroyed, encircled by Hannibal's army. It was awful. It was really just terrible. And boom, there's Cannae today. There's like still a monument to all the Romans who were killed, like 2,200 years ago, right? And then Rome had it hard in Sicily because the Sicilians started revolting against them, led by this guy right here, Archimedes in Syracuse. He was sort of like a mad scientist type figure. He's the Eureka guy, by the way, understanding water displacement and whatnot. He came up with this device called Archimedes' Claw that supposedly helped like overturn ships that were trying to come into the harbor at Syracuse. We have no idea what that thing looked like, but here's some examples. I love this one the most. I don't know why. I guess it's because it's in the shape of a claw, actually. And so the Romans had a hard time sort of getting past him. He also supposedly used lasers from the sun. What? Like some sort of weird series of mirrors to catch ships on fire that were trying to come in, and so the Romans had to deal with that. And eventually, though, the Romans were able to get in there into Syracuse, which is one of the main cities in Sicily, and get into the city and take it over. And they wanted to take Archimedes alive, but Archimedes actually refused to get up. He was in the middle of doing a math problem, and the Roman soldier finally was like, "All right, I've had enough of you. Goodbye." All right. So, long story short, how did the Romans actually win this war? I mean, my goodness, Hannibal's taken by them by surprise and is killing them, and then Sicily is all nuts. Well, it's this guy right here, this Roman. Look at him. He looks kind of stern, and he's bald. Scipio is his name, one of the most famous Romans who ever lived. He actually had a lot of success fighting against Hannibal's brothers' forces in Spain. Took over Spain for the Romans, and then he decided, you know what, I'm not going to go to Italy and fight against Hannibal. The best way to get Hannibal out of Italy, especially like prevent him from attacking Rome directly, is for me to take my army and go to Carthage and just like attack it, because nobody else is going to do that. And it worked. The Carthaginians freaked out. They recalled Hannibal. They were like, come on, you got to come back here and save our town. And they met in the desert, and Scipio actually used Hannibal's crazy tactics against him and won the battle. Whoa, dang, dang, dang. All right, so then, as I mentioned, after that, Rome does a lot of fighting in Greece, in Spain. Carthage is still there, but it's not really. They had to get rid of their navy and all this. And Rome is fighting in Eastern Europe as well. So we fast forward a whole bunch, and now we get down here. So look at this, the first servile war, and then you got these two guys, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus, who are tribunes of the plebs. Well, let's talk about this first servile war. Servile is what, this is the name for it, first servile war. It's essentially a revolt of enslaved people. It's a slave rebellion. And it happened on the island of Sicily by a slave named Eunice initially. And he essentially was able to raise an army of about 60,000 people. And what do they want? They wanted freedom, of course. They wanted their freedom, and they wanted to stop being so abused. So when the Romans got control of Sicily, like really, really, really firm control of it, they started building these huge, massive land estates. And because they've been conquering all these places around the Mediterranean, they were now slave dealers and slave traders. And they were taking these people who had been captured in war, and they were sending them to Sicily. And the Sicilians who owned the land, the rich Sicilians, were treating the slaves awfully, just really bad conditions. And so enough was enough. And Eunice was able to gather supposedly, like 60,000 soldiers, and they fought very bravely against the Romans, defeated several Roman armies before there was one army who came in, one general. I can't remember his name, doesn't matter, but he eventually crushed the rebellion. But it's important for you to know that, yes, in this society that had people who were enslaved, they certainly had rebellions, just as happened in America. Unfortunately, we don't really, I feel like a lot of times in U.S. history classes, we just sort of like gloss over the slave rebellions that happened, but they happened all the time in the United States, and they happened all the time in the ancient world as well. This one was just massive. I mean, 60,000 people, just incredible. Now, at that same time that the slave rebellion is happening, these two brothers kind of come to the forefront. Actually, the oldest one, Tiberius first, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, they were the grandsons of Scipio, the guy who beat Hannibal in the Second Punic War, and they kind of had like a very liberal upbringing in terms of their education, sort of forward-thinking, progressive, and they saw how many Romans were honestly sort of displaced in the economy after all the wars. Like all the stuff was coming in, all these luxurious goods and riches were coming in, but they were sort of benefiting only a very tiny sliver of the population. And the Gracchi brothers felt like that was wrong, and that the Romans needed to give back to the poor in some way. And so, what did Tiberius Gracchus do? Well, he became tribune of the plebs in the year 133, and he said, "Hey, look back to the Lex Licinius Sextia. You know those first two about the one of the year's co-consuls being a pleb? Yeah, we got that. And debt? Yeah, that's not a problem anymore. But how about that third part of the law? No one can possess more than 500 acres of land. Here's what I propose, Romans. I propose that we actually enforce that law." And oh my God, what do you think happened to him? Yep, some angry senators clobbered him to death, and 300 of his supporters, and they threw their bodies into the Tiber River. I mean, here's a sitting tribune of the plebs. This is what they do to him and his followers. This man is sacrosanct. Like, that's the whole thing about a tribune of the plebs. You're not even allowed to touch them. But it didn't stop these senators from doing it. Oh my goodness. Now, 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius comes along, and Gaius is even sort of more quote unquote radical. He's like, yeah, you know what? I think we should do that whole Land Reform Act thing. We should have cut it down so that nobody has more than 500 acres of land, and we should actually be giving poor people some of that land. And by God, we should be selling corn to poor people at a very low price. And you know what? The government should pay for soldiers' equipment. It shouldn't be deducted from their pay. Most soldiers were poor. And some other things to try and to really limit the corruption that was going on among the Senate. And yeah, you know what happened. Of course, they killed him too. So, and like 3,000 of his supporters or something like that. Just nuts, just absolute nuts. Okay. Now, at this point, Rome turns inward and they start fighting each other. And we don't necessarily have that plebeian versus patrician split anymore. Now we have the split that's sort of like the populares. That means politicians who supported the rights of the common people, kind of like the Gracchi brothers, versus the optimates, the quote-unquote best people, that's what they named themselves anyway, who were politicians who sort of supported the wealthier people. They were not like true political parties in that sense. They were sort of more like alliances of different families, but they certainly played a huge role. And certainly in the future, that's how politicians would identify themselves. Now, getting up to the year 100, when Julius Caesar is born, look, there was another slave war also in Sicily that occurred. It wasn't as big as the first Servile War, but still, the enslaved people who revolted during the second Servile War were able to win a few battles here and there. I think they only had an army of about 20,000, but then they were eventually defeated. Now, one of the biggest Romans who comes to the forefront right now is a guy named Marius, and he fights against a rebel king in Numidia, in northern Africa, named Jugurtha, defeats him, and also defeats two Germanic tribes in northern Italy, and he gets named co-consul 6 times, 5 times in a row, which is crazy. And he has an assistant through all this named Sulla, and Marius and Sulla later become arch enemies. In fact, they fight Rome's first civil war. A lot of people think that Julius Caesar is the one who starts the Roman Civil War, but he had teachers, and here they were, Marius and Sulla. Marius, by the way, is Caesar's uncle by marriage, not by blood. And in this context, Julius Caesar is born. And of course, we'll fill in the rest of the gaps by reading Always I Am Caesar. Okay, thank you. Hope that helps.